Okay. Hello and welcome to Tricycle's 30th anniversary celebration. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. This is the third live session in a series that we'll host over the next several weeks, and we'll be talking with many of the people, old friends and new, who have been central to Tricycle's success. Today's session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live. You can view any of the session recordings as well as the speaker lineup and schedule for upcoming events at the same link that you're at now. We are providing these events for free, so if you haven't already and you'd like to support Tricycle, please consider donating at the button below. We will have some time for Q&A towards the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of those as possible. So our guests today are Ruth Ozeki and Stephen Batchelor. Ruth Ozeki is an award-winning Canadian-American author, filmmaker, and Zen Buddhist priest. Her books and films, including the novels My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, and A Tale for the Time Being, seek to integrate personal narrative and social issues, including environmental politics, race, and war. Her upcoming novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, which I just read, Ruth, it's a beautiful book, will be out in September of this year. Ruth teaches creative writing at Smith College, and we'll put a link to advanced sales of that book in our chat. And like I say, it's a really great book. And I should also mention that Ruth is having some technical problems. There's a bit of an echo, so please be patient. Stephen Batchelor is a Buddhist teacher, artist, and author known for his secular approach to the dharma. He is co-founder and faculty member of Bodhi College in England, which is focused on contemplative learning and the study and practice of Buddhism as found in the earliest texts. His numerous books include Buddhism Without Beliefs, After Buddhism, and The Art of Solitude, among others. I should also add that Stephen has been a great friend of the magazine since its inception. So Ruth and Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
It's so great to see you, and thank you everybody for your patience. We are having a few technical problems, but I think we'll get through them. But you know, I asked Ruth to start by reading a little snippet from her book called In the Beginning. The book is called The Book of Form and Emptiness, but this is the beautiful way in which the book begins. So Ruth?
Sure. In the beginning. A book must start somewhere. One brave letter must volunteer to go first, laying itself on the line in an act of faith, from which a word takes heart and follows, drawing a sentence into its wake. From there, a paragraph amasses, and soon a page, and the book is on its way, finding a voice, calling itself into being. A book must start somewhere, and this one starts here.
Fold in the creative process, but maybe you have something different to say about it, or?
James, again, I missed the beginning of your question. I wasn't.
I mean, if our technical people are listening, I keep getting muted for some reason. Somebody's muting me on the other side of the wall. So I was asking what that says to you, or what you're telling us about the creative process.
Yeah. I think I see what's happening technically. Anyway, sorry. The echo keeps coming back in and out. It's interesting because the creative. Oh boy, this is difficult. The echo keeps coming in and out. For me, when I start to write a book, I usually start by hearing a voice. And so that's why I think it's so funny that what I'm hearing is the echo of my own voice. And so it's always hard to know exactly where that voice comes from. I mean, it's not that I'm hearing it actually outside of me, but it's not me either. It's somewhere in between the inside and the outside. And it kind of lives in this, this kind of place where I think, where we meet the world, and for lack of a better description. And so what I find is that very often there's something about the attitude that I have to bring to my writing, that is very similar to the attitude I have to bring, or that, not that I have to, but that I do bring to Zazen, to meditation practice. And it's this attitude of sort of complete openness and relaxation. And when I'm able to, sort of tap into or find that attitude in my body and in my mind, then suddenly, the voices can come to me, right? I'm able to sort of sit in this place of sort of openness, and and the voices are available somehow. And in this case, it was the voice of the book itself that started speaking to me. And so the narrator of the book is the book itself, calling itself into being. And so that little section that I just read is the book sort of introducing itself, and speaking itself onto the page.
Stephen, if you want to interject at any time or have any questions, that's fine. I would encourage conversation between the two of you. But I just want to say one thing before I ask Stephen something. The book comes alive in its discussions with its protagonist. And it has a bit of an attitude. It's far more revealing than the protagonist would like. And I found that also a sort of creative twist. Like the book itself comes alive and starts speaking just as all inanimate objects do in the book.
Yes.
You want to say something about that?
Yeah. Well, the book is about a little boy who hears voices after the death of his father. When he's quite young, he starts to hear his father's voice, and then from there, he starts to hear the voices of other things as well, inanimate objects in the house, in school, out in the world, and really I think. It's always hard to say where the idea of a book comes from, but certainly part of where this comes from is from the koan, the Dongshan koan, do inanimate beings speak the dharma? And of course, as I was sort of thinking about this and sitting with this koan, the idea of and I was reading other things as well. I was reading other philosophy. I was reading Timothy Morton's Object-Oriented Ontology and Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. And so this idea that matter can be vibrant, that matter can express itself into the world is something that was really intriguing to me. And so I think that's certainly one of the inspirations for the book. And one of the things that I did was I kind of made a rule for myself. I think one of the hard things when you're writing is to get out of your own way. And so I made this rule for myself that whenever something interesting came into my life, I would put it into the book and see what it said, and the book sort of is an interpreter of things. And so, for example, things like, a little snow globe, right? Somebody gave me a little snow globe, and so I put it into the book. I gave it to the book. And then this huge sort of, constellation of metaphors around snow globes started to occur. So anyway, it's a way of playing, I think, but it's also a way of taking my own kind of controlling, narrative mind and, sort of opening it up a little bit and allowing more to come in.
That's wonderful. Stephen, I was thinking about you a lot lately because I've been taking your seminar, and you talk a lot about creativity and breaking habitual patterns and responding with creativity in the present as it unfolds, as sort of kind of flow and unblocking. I remember in the Devil book, you talk about path and obstructions, and I've seen this idea develop over time. And you're also a collage artist. A lot of people don't know that. You make quite beautiful collages. And I'm wondering, for you, how the creative process works.
Well, I've asked myself this question a lot, and my only really honest answer is I don't know. I don't know how the creative process works, but all I know is that when I feel most fully alive, it's in those moments where I think that something is being created. As Ruth said, in some ways you have to kind of get out of the way of that, and you have to allow something else to somehow have the space to come through. And to me, creativity is the opposite of reactivity. Where
Oh,
reactivity is about, the mind that sort of goes round, 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 the samsara, our inner samsara. And when that begins to quieten down, when that sort of slows down or even stops, and I think in meditation, in Zazen, we do find moments where that kind of circular repetitiveness dies down. And often it's in the space that then opens up, this rather non-reactive space, that other possibilities then emerge. And I've also found, echoing Ruth, that when I write or when I make art, I have to naturally get myself into a different state of mind. And that state of mind, and I noticed this in the monastery where I was training in Korea, after having done a long 3-month retreat, then we had a period where we could do what we wanted. And I found that as I sat down to write, which is what I do, I found weirdly the state of mind in preparing to write was pretty much the state of mind I try to get into in Zazen. It's much the same. And so to me, therefore, creativity and reactivity are sort of, going on together in a way. But it's only when the reactivity pauses or stops that something new can come forth. And I've also read your book, Ruth, and I thought it was really, really wonderful. I think it's an extraordinary piece of writing. And what came to my mind in reading it is Dogen's idea of when you forget the self, you can be enlightened by all things. And I'm fairly certain you had that in the back of your mind somewhere. But I'm very glad you didn't quote it in the book. And I'm very glad you didn't quote the Heart Sutra in your book. But that, I feel, is really what your book opened up. And I have a little note here that also reflects what you just said. I felt that by making the book one of the voices, you actually undermine the autocratic isolation of the authorial voice. In other words, of Ruth Ozeki. And when I first saw that, got that as happening, I had a moment where I was no longer able to suspend disbelief. It was odd. And then suddenly I found myself, perfectly happy going along with the unfolding narrative of these different voices without there having to be a controlling central voice. And I think that's quite remarkable that you've pulled that off, frankly.
I played with that, and there's a character in the book who is the typing lady, right? And I had always been thinking, she's just a really peripheral character who shows up once in a while and makes a few comments, and mostly what she does is just sit there and type. And actually, she's the character I feel closest to in the book, just somebody who just listens and types things. And yes, the Dogen quote, of course, it's from Genjo Koan, and I totally feel, I feel like busted, when Stephen identifies it so clearly. But it's to study the Buddha way is to study the self. I'm going to quote it now. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things of the world. When actualized by the myriad things, the body mind of self and the body mind of other, I'm loosely translating here, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace. And the way I like to think of it is the no trace continues to express itself endlessly. And it's a slight tweak on the traditional translation, but it's a beautiful passage. And I think it is exactly what Dogen is, I think, describing Zazen, but of course Dogen was a writer, so I think he was describing, the creative process as well.
Yeah.
You both talk a lot about, well, Ruth, your book is full of voices. There's a cacophony of voices, and objects speak. And you, in a sense, I feel like this character is trying to find his voice. It's something that Stephen talks about. Stephen, you've actually played with the notion of right speech as voice. I don't know if you've settled there, but right speech in a way becomes voice, finding one's own voice. Would the two of you like to address that? Stephen, first you might say something about your understanding of that, and then Ruth, you can respond.
Well, I mean, we're all familiar, I suspect, with the idea of the Eightfold Path, and then you have, write this, write that. Then you have right speech. And the way it's normally presented is in terms of what is morally, ethically good speech. So it's about, speak gently and speak truthfully and speak harmlessly and so forth and so on. And of course, that's important. But the word in Pali is vacha, Sanskrit vacha, which is actually a cognate of the Latin word vox, the English word voice. So I've started thinking of it not so much as speech, but actually as voice, and particularly in terms of finding one's own voice. And I'm thinking of what we traditionally call right speech. I find it's been very helpful to think of it as actually finding your own voice. And if the person who enters the Eightfold Path, as the early texts say, becomes independent of others in the practice, then in terms of speech or voice, it's about finding your own voice. In other words, allowing those voices that you've internalized from your parents, from your political leaders, your religious teachers, which are, very powerfully informing how we speak, how we think. And again, I think what meditation allows us to do is to see that going on more clearly, and thereby to open up a space in which we're not just vocalizing what our community, what our authority figures believe and say. And of course, I think as we're educated, we go through a process of differentiating ourselves from the collective voices of our culture, religion, etc. And in doing so, particularly if we have an aspiration to be, let's say, a writer or someone working in a creative field, then we're constantly seeking to, in a sense, differentiate our own particular voice. And it's really, I think, about finding one's own truth, one's own authenticity, and also, I think very importantly, finding a kind of honesty within life. And, speaking without hesitation and reserve as to what other people are going to think, and to really be able to trust more and more the intuitions and the deeper feelings that you don't really understand or even feel terribly comfortable with, but you trust as somehow opening you up into another way of understanding yourself, of being in the world, of living, of working. And so yeah, I think it is important. I mean, it's almost a mantra of the creative writing world is, finding your own voice, not deriving it from your favorite authors. And it's an ongoing process too. I don't think you'll ever get there in some sort of final definitive way, but it's a journey, I think, that is part and parcel of this Eightfold Path.
Ruth?
It's interesting because as a novelist, and as a novelist who works very often with characters who are autobiographical, I kind of, sometimes I think of the novel as being a kind of thought experiment, and the self as being not just a fixed, a fixed permanent entity, which of course, as Buddhists, we know it's not, but an array, an array of selves that are constantly changing. And that's what my characters are. So for me, the process of writing is a kind of thought experiment, a kind of performance art, in a way, listening to all of those voices, including the villainous ones who are constantly trying to make me shut up, and we hear a lot of villainous voices, I think, these days. I mean, we're just so completely overwhelmed by media and social media, and there are many, many voices in the world right now, and it's very confusing. It's a cacophony. But in any case, in my fictional worlds, then what I do is to try to sort of inhabit those voices and put them in conversation with each other. And so in that sense, it is like a kind of thought experiment, because you're putting these voices in conversation with each other and seeing what emerges, seeing what kind of conversation emerges. And I just want to say too, that's also what the book itself is. Any book is. We think of a book as being, an object, right? And so this is my book. When in fact, I think that's not at all accurate, because of course, the book that that you read, James, and the book that Stephen reads are two different books, and they're different from the book that I wrote. Right. I wrote that book when I wrote A Tale for the Time Being. I was, that was in 2012, and that Ruth Ozeki doesn't exist anymore. Right. The book that, that person wrote in 2012, you might have read yesterday. Right. And so it's a kind of, it's a way of speaking across time. And I really do feel that that the process of reading and writing is a collaborative effort, right? And so we're not making a singular book. We're making, an array of books, and everyone who reads a book is going to be reading something slightly different. So that too is a creative, right? It's a creative, generative act, and the kind of conversation. I mean, that's why writing is wonderful to me, because it's an invitation to that kind of dialogue.
It's interesting because I did a podcast with Arthur Z, and he spoke similarly about his poetry, that the person who wrote it back then, and the person who wrote it now, and the person who's reading it now, and the person who's reading it then, even the same reader, these are different voices and different people experiencing the same text.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. Stephen, do you have something to say about that with regard to your own work, or?
Well, I have had the experience more than once of reading a quote in another person's book and thinking, "Oh, that's quite interesting," and then looking up to see the source, and it turns out to be me. And or in other words, not recognizing what you think of as my voice, what I said, my brilliant idea. It becomes there's a weird sort of sense of dislocation. But I think it sort of makes the point that Ruth is communicating to us, is that, again, we're attached to the voice as being mine. It's not really mine, except in a sort of rather loose, conventional sense.
Right.
It's not your voice, but it is really rather bizarre where voices come from. And I think Heidegger said something like, he says, we do not have ideas, ideas have us, or we do not have words, words have us. And as a writer, I become very often rather spookily aware of that. And I find that, there's my mind saying, I've got to finish this chapter and I've got to work out how to say this properly. And often I get stuck at that space, and then I go off and do something quite different. And then by itself, suddenly sentences form, they come to me. There's something I probably wouldn't have figured out with my intellect. And yet there's a source of language bubbling up within me that really is something outside of my ownership and control. And what I do as a writer in many ways is simply, in a sense, hold that space and create a channel whereby these voices can be heard. And it's a very strange business. And I love writing books because it's basically a journey into the unknown. I don't know, by any morning when I'm writing, I start out with some vague ideas at 9 a.m. By 1 p.m., when I stop, something is on the page that I would never have conceived of 4 hours earlier. It's, maybe the rough outline, but the actual formulation of words, and very often ideas and things I'd never thought of come through by what strikes me sometimes as the logic of the text. That you follow, you surrender to the logic of the text, and you allow that to come forth. And heard an echo there. And that to me is magical. And I'm very interested at the moment in trying to find a Buddhist equivalent of creativity. And I think it's actually the idis, or the idipada, what are usually translated as the magical powers. In other words, where you can walk through walls and you can fly through the sky and you can become one or become many, and all of those kinds of things, which all Buddhist traditions take literally. But if you look at where that practice is located in the overall scheme of the Buddhist path, particularly in the early tradition, you find that it's actually, it's this very basic sort of practice, but it's got totally marginalized because it's been interpreted as magical powers. And but leave that aside, and I think that Idi refers to creativity, and creativity is a magical power. Art has got something of magic about it, and so to that extent, I think there's a challenge for us, at least for me, to try to re-own creativity as an explicit part of the practice of dharma. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been lost in many ways. Not to say that Buddhist cultures are very creative, obviously, lots of creative people, but Buddhism has not theorized creativity. It's not actually come up with a way of thinking about it in Buddhist terms.
Can I respond to that briefly?
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
And I'm hearing the echo too, but maybe it'll go away. It seems to be going away. Yes. It reminds me, Stephen, of the book, which I have right here. It's Eihei Dogen, Mystical Realist. And yeah. Oh, it's backwards. Anyway, there's no point in showing you. But in any case, Taigen Dan Layton wrote a foreword to that book in which he proposed that Zazen is a performance art, that Dogen's Zazen is performance art. And that, because, Zazen is a goalless practice, and, and when we sit, we are manifesting our Buddha nature, right? And we are becoming one with our Buddha nature. That is a type of performance art, and as a result, and as a performance art, it is inherently creative. And I've always thought that was really, interesting. It's generative. In other words, meditation is a generative, creative act. And I've always thought that was beautiful, and it gave me a way too to think about Buddhist ritual as a type of generative performance that we are, collectively in the Sangha as we move around and, make offerings and do prostrations, that we're collectively performing, it's a creative performance that we're doing together. We're inhabiting the Buddha body, right, as a Sangha, and expressing it. Again, just expressing it endlessly, because of these are the rituals that are passed down, and the language that's passed down over time, right? So it's just constantly, it's constantly being passed down, it's constantly being changed, it's constantly being enlivened and reimagined.
Well, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the philosopher Judith Butler's conception, a performative conception of self.
Yeah, exactly.
The self is a performance.
Yeah.
And I think what, in other words, who you and I are, we're performing. We may not think that way, but there's something very performative about it. And who you are is not therefore what you are in some sort of ontological or metaphysical sense, some pure ego or something. But what you are is basically your performance. It's how you perform, how you present yourself in the world, how you speak, how you communicate. That's what you are. And you'll find passages in the Dhammapada, verse 80, for example, says, he says, just as a farmer irrigates a field, as a fletcher fashions an arrow, as a carpenter shapes a piece of wood, so the wise person trains the self.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, contrary to the idea that Buddhism is about getting rid of the self, it's about letting go of certain attachments to self, yes. It's not about getting rid of self. It's actually understanding self as a work in progress, as an ongoing performance, as something that is constantly unfolding, an unfinished project in that sense. And I like the way that Dan Layton has, in a sense, bagged that within Dogen, because likewise, our communities can also be thought of in terms of communal performance. And there's something liberating about that, because it gets us out of the idea that, that all religious activity is somehow repetitive. It's keeping a tradition going by doing the same thing again and again and again and again. There is, of course, room for that, but the danger is that if that becomes normative, then basically the tradition is stuck. Nothing much is really going to happen. Whereas if we can hold that structure in a way that actually liberates us to in a sense, perform our lives more wisely, more compassionately, more creatively, more inventively, more kindly, more empathetically, then I think the two ideas meet up very well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. Great.
Okay, before we go to Q&A, I had another question. Stephen, you've talked about this, and Ruth, I heard hints of it in your book with regard to the book's territory as the dark side also, places where people are reluctant to go, and you certainly take us there in the book. And Stephen, I was wondering, when you mentioned during one of your seminars that the creative act, giving up control and acting creatively in the moment entailed some degree of risk due to the uncertainty that we face. Do you want to talk about that, and then maybe Ruth can respond?
To me, it seems that if we start looking at the Dharma in the light of Dogen and some of these other texts, then we increasingly, by giving autonomy and authority to each practitioner, we become less and less able, I think, to think of morality or ethics as basically just following the precepts, doing the right thing according to what the Buddhist tradition tells us is the right thing. And instead, we find ourselves more and more confronting life situations, often situations of great suffering, of great difficulty, of great conflict, and being in a position where we cannot but respond, to say something, to do something, to intervene, to interact in some way, or perhaps to withdraw and remain in silence. There's no fixed right thing to do. And this then opens up the idea of an ethics of risk, that a genuine ethical response is one that has to accept the fact that I cannot know what the consequences of my action is going to be. I might have prepared myself and got as much information as I can, but at a certain point I have to jump. I have to say something, do something, and very often it's very, very difficult to get to that, to take that risk. But once we do, then I think very often, and you may have probably experienced this yourselves, you find yourself taken over by a flow of words, physical gestures, embracing, or whatever it might be, that doesn't again seem to be coming so much from you, but seems to have been allowed by your being willing to risk making a response rather than just repeating platitudes of the tradition or saying the right Buddhist thing. And this opens up, I think, an understanding of ethics that's, in a sense, scary, because we can never be assured of being right. We can never be sure that this is the good thing to do, because we cannot possibly see the consequences and the outcomes of our acts.
This is so interesting, Stephen, because you're talking about it from a Dharma perspective, and I'll just take that and talk about that from the perspective of writing, writing anything, of utterance, right? And of course, I've always felt that that I write from remorse, that most of my writing happens because I've done something or said something or thought something that's potentially harmful, that might have hurt somebody. And so having that seed of remorse, then I sit with that and try to figure out, how did that happen? And so then I start to perform that, right? I start to perform that, and that performance turns into a novel, right? And that's certainly how the first novel came. And I think subsequent novels have come out in the same, have started in the same sort of way. And I just think it's interesting because the act of doing anything, right? I mean, just living, being alive in the world is fraught, right? And so, how do we make sense of that? And how do we constantly examine that in ways that, that allows us to lead a life where we do perhaps no harm, but we do a little bit less harm, right? And that we're constantly looking at that and examining it. And for me, I think the fiction writing is once again a kind of a thought experiment that takes these ideas. It in the same way that when we meditate, what comes up so often are the terrible things that we've said to somebody, or, the remorse is constantly there. The voices of remorse are constantly there. In when I'm working on a book, it might take me 10 years to write a book, right? I'm very slow, but I think that's because the process of examining these things takes such a very long time. I'm glad I have this. I'm glad I have this practice because it allows me to do it. I don't know how I would do it without having both the writing and the Buddhist practice together. The two are very, very helpful and synergistic in that way.
Ruth, I just had a quick question. You mentioned remorse. Could you say something more about that, what the connection to your writing is?
Just this idea that you can't really, for example, I wrote my first book because I felt remorseful about some of the work that I had done in commercial television, where, for example, I made programming that was being sponsored by Philip Morris at a time when I was trying to quit smoking, and I knew perfectly well about the evils of smoking, right? But I was I was making films or making TV shows and doing that because I needed to pay the rent and et cetera, et cetera. And so, that led me to write my first novel, which was My Year of Meats, which was a novel about media representation, the sort of collusion between capitalism and media representation, and how that works. And it was centered around in this case, the meat industry. Okay. And so I wrote that book, put it out into the world, felt, happy about it for a very short while, and then suddenly realized, that I hadn't really done justice to, or taken into account, the complexities of trying to be, for example, a farmer, a cattle rancher, right? The pressures that somebody who is trying to, raise cattle for a living might feel. I felt like I'd shortchanged them. I hadn't given a complete picture, because you can't give a complete picture in a novel, right? I mean, it has to have a beginning and an end, right? And so there's always something outside that world, right, that you have not talked about, or that you've neglected, or that you've given short shrift to. And so then I started feeling remorseful about that. I started feeling that I hadn't really investigated the complexity of trying to be a farmer in America. And so the second book was a book about farming in America, where I tried to sort of investigate, in that case, the collusion between, capitalism and farming, right, agriculture. So in any case, my point here being that, at every juncture, everything I do causes some sort of remorse. I'm sure that after I get off this phone call, I'll have tremendous remorse about various things that I said. And then, and that will lead me to, maybe write another book, or I don't know what, but it's always inspired. It's always, as long as you feel remorse about things, in a way, it's too bad, because it means that you've done something that, might be harmful. On the other hand, as a writer, I almost am grateful for that, because it means that I'll never run out of things to write about.
Well, remorse always beats guilt. But before we go to our questions, I'd just like to say that a link to Ruth's book is in the chat field, and a link to Bodhi College should also be there. I take courses at Bodhi College myself. It's a really wonderful place. So we're going to go to some questions, and we're going to start with Daniel Ramirez, who asks, we'll start with Tom, who asks, I'd be intrigued to know how you balance time spent creating with time either consuming or meditating.
Who wants to answer that?
I'll go first if something's happened now. Well, I find this an ongoing process. Like Ruth said, I find the same. I find that periods of writing, especially if I'm in the midst of a book, need to be balanced with periods of just being quiet, of switching off, of calming down. And I find that what happens is that I enter into a kind of a rhythmic flow, in some sense, that what I write about in the morning, it sort of goes fallow in the afternoon. But at the same time, that allows what it is that I will continue to do the next morning to sort of organically start coming to the bubbling up to the surface in its own way. And I experience this so much now that I completely trust the process. I don't worry anymore that I'm not going to have anything to say the next day. I know that it'll come in its own time, and I will have the ability to then take it on to the next step. And I find that one of the most rewarding and fulfilling things that that I've ever experienced. And that's what makes writing such a worthwhile and such a central part of my life, is that it enables me to somehow settle into this kind of rhythmic flow.
Well, I got a little greedy a few years ago, and I started teaching. I was offered a job at Smith College, and I started teaching. And I used to have a life more like what Stephen described, where I actually had time, long periods of time and sort of a regular schedule. And now that I teach, I don't have that as much anymore. And but at the same time, I learn so much from teaching, and I get so much out of teaching that I don't want to give that up. It's such a wonderful thing to be working with young people. And, it's frustrating at times, but most of the time it's wonderful. And I learn, I learn so much from it. I wish I had more time. My problem is that these days that I don't really have the kind of time that I, used to have and would like to have more of. So I'm still really working on that balance. That balance is a work in progress. Whenever I can, I try to, make time to, to sit and to, go out for walks and but it's been a really long time since I've read novels, for example. That's something that has kind of dropped out. So I'm hoping in any case, now I'm between books, and I'm hoping that, I'm really hoping that I don't start a new book anytime soon, so I can enjoy some of that, that fallow time that Stephen talks about.
But it's not you who starts the book, Ruth. It's the book that starts you.
I know, and that's a problem, right? I can't control that.
Well, I don't usually get to read novels, but this one I could justify certainly for work. So it was a great pleasure. So now we'll go to Daniel Ramirez's question. How does an aspiring artist work with the grasping of ambition, the desire to have their work seen and shared with others? Ruth, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start that. I first of all, ambition gets a bad rap, and it can be, excuse me, ambition gets a bad rap, and it can be really crippling. At the same time, it can be very motivating. And so I think, as with everything, the there's a sweet spot in the middle way. There's a sweet spot in the middle there. And I think that it's only natural if you're making things, creativity is a gift, right? It's a gift that we're given. And when you give a gift, you want to give, if I receive a gift, I want to give a gift, right? And so whatever it is that you make, it wants to be given. And so I think, if you think about ambition that way, it's not so much your ambition, perhaps. It's that the thing that you're making, right? The thing that you are making in collaboration with the world wants to move out back into the world. And that's not a bad thing. That's a beautiful thing. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say here is don't beat up on yourself if you're feeling ambitious, because it might not be your ambition. It might be the desire of your creation to go out and talk to other people and to interact and collaborate, right, with other people as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's true. Ambition is thought of as kind of bad. But again, I think that might be a reflex, especially in the Buddhist world, of a sort of rather wary attitude towards worldly activities of different kinds, and ambition is part and parcel of that. And of course, it's tied up with egoism. And you look at a lot of ambitious people, and you see that they're completely addicted to, some kind of response or a like or being affirmed in some way. But that's also part of growing. This is part of life in a way. And in my own case, I've struggled with this when I first was starting to write the sort of books I write. I was very anxious about whether people would like it, whether it would be well received, whether I'd find a publisher, and wanting to sort of, be heard and to get my point of view across, and all those things. That's less of a problem now. I've kind of established myself in a sort of a particular niche, and I don't have to worry about those sort of existential issues so much anymore. But on the other hand, I always, when I'm writing, I'm also creating collage works out of pieces of found material. And I quite deliberately keep that aspect of my creative work totally out of the public domain. I'm not interested in showing the work at galleries or somehow becoming known for that. It really is not an issue for me, but it's extremely important that my written work is somehow complemented by a process of non-conceptual, non-verbal composition. It's about organizing materials, which is what books is doing. It's organizing words, basically. I like organizing colors and shapes. And I don't know why that plays such a role in my written work, but I know deep down that it's indispensable for that. And so perhaps that's why I can free myself from the, let's say, the more negative side of ambition by doing something without any particular ambition at all.
That just made me think about effort, right? About right effort, and about how effort is one. It's not. It maybe, I don't know. It's akin to ambition here in the sense that when you are making too much of an effort, you're getting in your own way, right? And so that's where I think it's important to just, sort of relax your hold on. I think relaxation is really what, is key for me, is just sort of relaxing your hold around the effort. And for me, the best way to do that is just, becoming, fully engaged in the process of writing itself. When I'm writing, I am not thinking about readers. I'm not thinking about publishing. I do my best not to. Because that takes me out of that particular moment that I'm in, and as soon as that happens, then I get distracted, and the writing no longer, works in the same way that it did. So anyway.
Another side of this is that if you look at the four iddhipada, the four foundations of what I'm calling creativity, the first one is desire.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's chanda. It's aspiration, desire, wanting something. But that's central. That's crucial. Again, Buddhism has a very awkward relationship with all kinds of desires. So I agree with that, and also very much with the idea that when you're in the midst of writing, these issues are completely irrelevant. The work itself is self-justifying. You don't need anything else. I don't care whether. I sometimes worry that I won't live to complete the book.
So this is so funny that you should say that, Stephen, because I'm an atheist. I'm Buddhist. Yet at the end of a book, I always, as I'm approaching the end, I find that I pray to God. I am always praying, dear God, please don't let me die before I finish this book. Now, it makes no sense, but it's, it is the time when I suddenly, I'm covering all the bases, I suppose, because, exactly that. It's, I just need to live long enough to finish this thing. Yeah. So now I am hugely relieved because it's pretty much done. So.
We normally associate creativity with artists and writers, but everyone has to be creative in their lives. Jean asks, how can non-writers benefit from writing themselves? Ruth, I know you teach, and I just like to take the idea of creativity out of the domain of artists into an individual's everyday life. I know you both probably have something to say about that.
I think to some extent we're all writers. Jean wrote that question, right? So you write. I don't think that writing is anything special, really. It's not something that belongs to writers. And we write email, we write text, we write shopping lists. We're constantly doing this. I mean, if you enjoy words, if you enjoy language, if you enjoy the process of thinking, of hearing your thoughts on paper, then you're, or on a screen, then you're a writer. And for example, for me, journaling, is extremely, it's a huge part of my writing, and I will never. I mean, I will burn those journals when I die, or somebody will, I hope, because it's not for anybody else but me, and so, but it's a way of being with my mind in a very intimate way that's similar to Zazen, similar to meditation, but also different because it's discursive, right? But it has that same quality of intimacy where, I'm just holding a pen and I'm following the point of the pen. My mind is just following the point of the pen. And I find that to be very, very cathartic, just to sort of watch the point of the pen and see what comes out.
I guess in the case of journaling, you hope you destroy it before you die. So,
Exactly.
Stephen, do you have anything to say about creativity for the layperson?
This question actually comes up quite a lot when I talk about creativity, that I pitch it as basically an artistic kind of activity or writing activity. And I know a lot of people don't connect to that. And I found it helpful actually to try to imagine the creative process involved in so many of everyday activities. Cooking, for example, gardening, the way you decorate the space in which you live. It doesn't have to be overtly artistic or literary. And I think that there's a danger in what we've been saying, that it's somehow making it a privileged activity of
That's right.
so-called creative people. But no, I think we all have this creative capacity, and I think we need to acknowledge it and exercise it. Years ago, I read a book by Amanda Coomaraswamy where he said that the artist is not a special kind of person, that each person is a special kind of artist.
Yeah.
And I like that inversion. In other words, we tend to sort of put artists and writers on pedestals, but maybe we should put it the other way around and see that each of us has this creative capacity, which is often untapped. And I think it's often, in a sense, inhibited because our culture says they're the creative people out there making music and writing books and stuff. And that, I think, is it's a very sad thing to do, because it somehow prevents us from acknowledging and appreciating, and more importantly, activating our own capacity to bring into being something that has never existed quite in that way before. And that can be a meal, it can be a piece of gardening work, it can be a novel, it can be a piece of art. It doesn't really matter what it is. I think what's important, and what I'd like to develop more in my own thinking, is how do we articulate creativity as an integral part of ordinary life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's following on that, EJ asks about shame. EJ feels so much shame often around writing. Can you say something about that, beginning with you, Ruth?
I would like to know. I would like to know more about where that source of shame comes from. I think that. The way that we're difficult, we're taught in a way that, where there are right ways to write and wrong ways to write, and writing is often, I think, experienced in school as a source of, almost public humiliation. There's aspects of that. So I think there's probably, I think a lot of people have a lot of, sort of scarring around that. So I think that's, I think that's difficult. I mean, one thing that I try to do myself is to give myself permission to, to write anything, knowing that it is just for me, and I am, it's what I said before, just it's a way of sort of being in touch with my own mind, right? It's a way of having a conversation with my own mind. And that's not for anybody else. So there's nobody else will ever see it. And that has helped me. I mean, I think it took me a long time to learn to write and learn to write in a public way. And I remember when I first published something, when I turned in the manuscript for my first book, I was absolutely mortified. I went to bed for a week, and I came up with this. It was kind of a joke, but it was like the mortification, formula, which is like the higher the degree of the mortification, the more, the better the book, the more honest the book, the more, and I'm not sure whether that's true. I think it was more just a sense of, like, oh my God, now everyone is going to see who I am, right? Everyone is going to know. And it was, I felt tremendous shame around that. And it took me years to get over it. I was also a filmmaker, and I felt the same thing with films when I put films out into the world. It really took me, it took me several decades of doing this kind of work. And now, it's still, as I mentioned before, there's still that remorse factor, but the shame part of it has quieted. And I'm glad about that. So anyway, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about this, because in the book, the character's like asking the book, do you really have to say so much, so many revealing things about me? So he's like, oh my God. And you say, well, your parents are for a game. This is a book about you. So I love that. Stephen, do you want to say anything about that?
No, not really. I agree with that. I mean, I followed a similar sort of curve to Ruth. I must admit, I do find it important for my own process to have my work appreciated and valued by others. And I think without that affirmation coming from not me, from others, I wouldn't perhaps have the confidence to keep going. I think it's very much a dialectical relationship you have with your readers or your students or whatever. And, I found that immensely valuable, especially in earlier, when I was first writing. To get people I respected saying, yeah, this is okay, this is quite good. I mean, you get the opposite too, of course. But those moments of affirmation from others is, I think, crucially important in overcoming your own sense of shame and embarrassment and inadequacy and all of those other things that can so easily plague us.
Okay, a few more questions. We're going a little bit over because of the technical problems in the beginning. But Mary asks, do you have rituals before you write?
I usually try to sit a little bit, even if it's just, not on a cushion, but just sitting quietly, in front of, like right here. Actually, this is where I do everything. I sit, I try to, close my eyes, drop into the body, find my breath, and just listen for a little while. And it's really about, stopping whatever it was that I was doing before, which was probably also at this desk, right? Because I do everything at this desk now. It's creating a little pause in between, what I was doing before, and then, starting to write. So that's one of my little rituals. And then sometimes I'll do other things too. Sometimes I'll tweak the lights and, this is my ritual. I always wear, this is so silly, but I always wear fingerless gloves. And it's something about having the, this part sort of is always, rubbing the keyboard. And so something about having fingerless gloves make me feel, like very, like I'm, a working person. And so anyway, that's helpful to me.
Stephen?
No, I don't. I don't have any particular ritual. It's when I start writing, I probably quite unconsciously spend a few moments just settling into a kind of contemplative space, but I don't do anything overt or specific.
I'll send you some of these gloves, Stephen, and you might
It
you might
might,
really like them.
I might, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yes, I start writing novels.
here's a comment. Is it terrible? It's a question, but it's a comment. Is it terrible that I hope Ruth Ozeki continues to feel remorse so that my favorite writer keeps writing?
Thanks.
That's from
Don't
Peter.
worry. There's no danger of the remorse stopping. I guarantee you, there's absolutely no danger of it.
Okay, so I think that about wraps it up. First, I want to say thank you to Stephen and Ruth. It was so generous of you to spend your time with us. I apologize for the technical difficulties to our listeners and to you, Ruth and Stephen, but I still enjoyed myself. It's wonderful hearing you both. You really have so much in common when I listen to the two of you together. So, to our listeners, come back next Tuesday, April 20th, to join Duncan Ryukin Williams for a talk on racial and spiritual reparations. We look forward to seeing you again soon. May everyone be healthy and safe. So thank you both.
Right.
Thank you.